let's get started again. I think the time is running up. So, welcome back. It's my pleasure now to welcome Professor Ashok Sangani. He did his PhD under Stanford University, and he's a professor at Syracuse University, and currently, for the last 3 years, heading the multiphase and particulate process division within NSF. So I would like to welcome him to give a government perspective on what kind of research are going on and what needs to be done in this area. Please join me in welcoming Ashok.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank Kumar for inviting me. As a program director, you're always concerned that you're only listening to the academic community most of the time. Yes. And so an opportunity to listen to Randy and to understand, the problems in industry, it's a good opportunity for me. And so I wanted to say something about Joshi. He's not here, but his first class was in 1975, and I was a student in that class. And I was telling Sumanta Acharya yesterday that absolutely the most wonderful teacher. He hardly spoke in the class, maybe 5 or 10 minutes in a whole hour, say something on the board, and he would walk around. And we would work on groups and try to get an answer before somebody else's group. He would come, note, and say, that's good. And then he would go on the board and present the solution, and then next problem. And he wrote the whole process control course with, I think, on average, only 5 to 10 minutes of talking in the class. And I think I understood the subject completely. And it was really amazing for somebody who's teaching it for the first time. So I have great respect for Professor Joshi and today's lecture group that he's truly an amazing teacher and scholar. So thanks for inviting me the same day that you have invited him. Okay, so what I wanted to do was just tell you what my program supports for the time being. That's mostly what I'm going to talk about in this. And in the afternoon, we'll have an opportunity to reflect upon what industry, university, and what government roles are. So my program is relatively small. The total portfolio is about 100 awards, and each is about 300K, and they're all very different problems. So my reason is we're not doing any grand challenge problem of 1 or 2. It's unsolicited proposals come with different ideas, and you just look at the merit of each idea on its own, rather than me having a grand vision about what particular problem should be solved. But if I were to say the vision is to support very fundamental research that would provide understanding of particulate and multiphase flows. So the key is understanding, and of course, also if it is related to developing an innovative process, that's better. So the innovation and understanding at a fundamental level is what we look for in each and every probe. Now, of course, the rest of the slide just shows that particles are everywhere, whether you do materials manufacturing or whether you are looking at some environmental problems or some chemical industry problem and so on. And I don't really need to talk about this particular those problems. So my portfolio, approximately can be broken down into 5 areas. Suspension by far is the largest one. And what I mean by suspension is all kinds of two-phase flows, basically, not just particles, but could be drops, bubbles, fluidized waves, and so on and so forth. Then a granular flow where fluid mechanics are not so much important, the particles rubbing each other, so it's a powder flow, basically. Then colloidal and nanoscale phenomena that happens in the particles that are submicron to nanometer in scale, and that's roughly about 27%. We also entertain problems that are related to biological or healthcare industry. So I would call that biological systems. And then there might be some very that are related to the particulate technology, that is making a very specialized kind of particles with very specific applications. It's relatively small, about 15% of my portfolio. Okay, so I just try to list because Kumar had already decided what my title would be, which is the challenges. And the challenges are, I can go on for many pages. Because of the diversity of particles, drops, bubbles, different scales and all that, there are all kinds of problems. So here are just some of them. For example, how does the particle scale physics and microstructure affect the macroscopic behavior? And there is a lot to study. A simple particle that might attract another particle might have very different behavior, for example. Or you might have drops that might be deforming, breaking up, and so on. And then there is a second question, which is that how does the microstructure depend on impulse flow? And that makes most of the two-phase materials highly non-Newtonian, because the flow that you impose dictates what the microstructure would be, and then in turn what the property would be. And so that understanding makes and what has happened, I would say, roughly, in 1990s, there was a sense that if you had a large-scale computer program that would do, say, 10,000 or 100,000 particles, you can do all kinds of problems. So that was kind of thinking in 1990s. And I think in 2000, there was no real central problem or grand challenge problem. As I see it, what happened was that the field completely kind of disintegrated into all kinds of problems. And that came about because, you can put electric field, magnetic field, there are capillaries. So there are all kinds of fields that you can put, and then there are size effects that you can account. You can make particles that are more interesting, like functionalized and so on. So I think I felt somewhat in 1990s we had a two-phase flow research had some central theme, and then in 2000 it opened up to all kinds of varieties. So it broadened up. So I'm sure by now you have read all the questions I have written here, and so I'm not necessarily going to read each one, every one of them. But I must say that we do fund things in forms, emulsions, sub-micro to nanoparticles, granular materials, soft particulates, biological cells. So this is a huge variety which contributes to different microscale physics and therefore different properties of the systems. Another key set of challenges that I see in a lot of proposals that are coming in last 5-10 years is how can we do a directed or self-assembly, either at nano or micron scale. And so you could do a directed assembly by putting electric field or magnetic field and so on. Or you can attach some DNA molecules and particles, and so you functionalize the particles. You could have particles that are non-spherical, and you can do a lot of interesting things if you have rods, for example, if you have disks and so on, or cubes and so on. So some of those things. Another set of problems that are very interesting are for those related to gels and glasses. That is, how can I form a gel? Because most consumer products are sold in the gel form. And the idea is you don't want things to settle out. If you buy a paint, you don't want to find after 2 days that all the stuff is sitting. So you want to remain it suspended and have a huge, long shelf life. So it has to be in the gel until you are ready to use it. When you apply it, then a little bit of yield stress, and now you can use it for paint. So the question, you have to add certain things, and the question is, what's the minimal amount you can add and form these gels that would remain stable for a long time? And what are really the rheological properties of these gels? What the state is like? What makes them stable or unstable? At the other end, you might have a higher volume fraction where you have a glass-like state, which means you have a very amorphous state and the particles are jiggling around but cannot move around much. So what is that state? How do I describe? What's the physics of it? And so on. And why that might be important? Because suppose you want to make a photonic crystals, you want to make the particles that are orderly. But at high volume fraction, there is a chance that instead of an ordered state, you might get a very disordered state. So you get a glass instead of a colloid crystal. And how do I get around doing it, and how do I make, if you understand it better, what the glass state is like and crystal state, and the particle systems are much better in trying to get providing us the understanding of those glass. And then, of course, in the end, you really want to make some innovative product that you understand the physics well, and then can we make it to solve the societal problems? So that's another challenge that like to be addressed through the program. So what I thought about doing is, we can ask some of our principal investigators to maybe send a slide or something. So you just get a flavor of the kind of projects that are being supported by this program. And I'm going to try to explain each and every slide. So this is meant to be more to give you a sort of, just to walk through some of the awards that we have made and what they try to do. And I'm a little biased here in putting some more on computational multiphase flow, knowing that that's the little kind of emphasis around here. So first few are more on computational multiphase flow, but just to show that we do fund other things, I have a few other slides. So here is an example of trying to push a liquid-liquid system through a packed bed of spheres. And these are computationally very challenging problems. Each drop here require about 6,000 elements to get an accurate drop breakup, and each sphere requires about 12,000. So you're now talking about a large system of things, and you have to solve it very accurately to get a behavior that is accurate. And then you can ask various questions once you have that. So there are some questions that are posed here, and they have found some interesting results, but I won't have time to go in details for that. So this is Alex Zinchenko at Colorado. Here is another project, Shankar Subramaniam at Iowa State University. And again, that's related to simulation of multiphase flow. One thing that tends to be the case in my program is that the physical phenomena we are looking at are relatively simple, does not involve a lot of different physics. So the goal is to understand one or two things in a great detail, so that it becomes something that on which you can maybe use more design calculations later on and so on. So and that's, I guess, is the nature of this sort of research at the NSF level, where you tend to support projects that are relatively simple, because the award sizes are typically only 300 gig. So here they're trying to, we had done some work earlier for what happens when particles have finite inertia, but inertia in the fluid is not as important. And so they're trying to extend here what would happen if the Reynolds number based on particle is not so small, and particles are flowing. How will they change various terms that go into the modeling of fluidized beds? And there are some instabilities that usually. By the way, one very important question that always happens in multiphase flow is what causes inhomogeneities. Okay, very big problem. Particles or bubbles or whatever, they tend to cluster, or there might be a large-scale instabilities that make things segregate and so on. So there's a lot of effort that is trying to understand that those aspects of instabilities in two-phase flows. What causes the inhomogeneity in particle volume fraction, for example. Here is along the same line, a project that is jointly funded for University of Colorado and Colorado School of Mines, trying to understand the instabilities in gas-solid suspensions. And they have shown here results for two special cases. One in which the particles, when they collide, they are inelastic, and they tend to therefore rebound with much less velocity. And then what would happen in those sort of things? So you you get an instability and you start clusters growing. Or you might have a situation where you have a finite Reynolds number. So it's a project here. Here is very large scale simulations involving a lot of GPUs and all that, much like what Kumar is doing, similar kind of expertise, looking at particles in turbulent flow. Okay. So I'm going to change gear a little bit. I'll show you an example of a biological problem. And here is a problem of understanding how a bacterial motion might lead to instabilities and therefore behavior. You know, often you hear biologists, they always talk about some chemical pathways creating some signals, and somehow they know how the biofilms form and so on. And you know, there are some biological aspects of it that are very important, but then all these things that when things cluster, say, you know, biofilm and so on, there are these larger scale phenomena that must be also important. So the transport becomes very important. And here is one simple example where these investigators are looking at what would happen if I have bacteria moving under chemotaxis. Chemotaxis means that you have a gradient, say gradient of oxygen or some nutrient. So they're moving in this particular direction. And what happens in this case is that when they're moving on average in that particular direction, they tend to be aligned. Now you can look at the flow that would be induced by a bacteria, and if all of them on average are aligned in some direction, now you have a collective motion that would result from it. And so these investigators predicted the wavelength of instability as to how the clusters would grow, and at what thickness the chemotaxis would you begin to see that pattern. And those theory have been in very good agreement with the experiment that are done by a different group. And on the other side, they have a very different problem in which you have evaporation drop, like a coffee kind of problem, where bacteria goes toward the drop edge, and there also they tend to cluster and form this inhomogeneous state. But they show that it's very, very different instability. So again, there are experiments done for this also. Here, this is a slightly older, but I like this, so I took it. It's not a current one, it got expired about 1.5 years ago, showing very accurate simulations of almost, you know, a foam-like, very high volume fraction drops, and shows that when you shear it, you get all kinds of different structures resulting from it. You can get shear banding, you can get shear localization, stress localization, you can create polydispersed things and segregation and so on. It's all through very detailed numerical simulation for this system. Now I'm going to move on to granular flow. So these are flows where the gas that is around the particle is not playing very critical role. And now the particles hit each other, and what happens is actually a simulation result showing that when you have powder flowing through and you have slight cohesive forces, you can get very different patterns of how, you know, they can, it's almost like they can have a thread, like you have an ordinary liquid that can have instabilities and drops forming. You can form drops like this and so on based on the cohesive forces. So here in the figure below, you have particles with a cohesive force of only 1 nanonewton, and the one above has 100 nanonewton. And see that slight cohesive forces can produce very big differences in the kind of patterns that you see in the powder that's flowing through. This one I just started supporting. He's a young faculty member at MIT, got a career award. And the idea here is to predict granular flow in the regime where you're going from where they're all jammed up to where they're fluid-like. So yeah, it's a very standard problem in industry if you have a hooper. And it's a problem that has confounded the theorists to get what is the rheology of powder that would go through this state. a very challenging problem. And what this investigator did is recently, he found that there was some article for emulsions where they realized that the rheology has to be non-local. What I mean by that is that normally many of these rheological relations that we tend to use in two-phase flow says that the stress at a point in a continuum depends on rate of strain or strain at that point. The non-local rheology says that it will depend on what's happening elsewhere too. So you can imagine that you have a heap of grain and some grain moves somewhere that might make some other grain move, and then eventually you would have flow here. So you can see that in a situation where you are close to jammed and unjammed region, that it is highly non-local. And one of the simplest way to do non-local is, is to introduce this concept of granular fluidity, and he showed that you can you have to solve an additional equation for that granular fluidity to account for the non-linearity, non-locality. And then there were some long-standing problems that were not resolved through average equations that were based on local, that was able to show that it works, and now it's trying to extend it to three-dimensional models and other geometries. How am I doing with that? Is that fine? So here is an example of how you might be able to you might be able to use a directed assembly of particles to make an interesting material. In this case, a thin film with particles that are embedded and that are in a periodic lattice. Okay, it could be used for photonic applications or for other situations. And so the key idea here is that these are particles at the interface between, say, gas and liquid, and they're protruding. Now there are capillary forces that tend to bring them together, so you have attractive forces. And if you just have that alone, then you create lots of defects, and you don't have control of the final microstructure. Suppose that you put an electric field normal to the interface. Now the electric field induces repulsive forces between the particles, because each particle then acts like a dipole. So now, by changing your electric field, and you can then manipulate, and you can produce a lattice which is essentially defect-free, and with the lattice size that you can change by changing the amount of electric field that you're putting in. And so they show that you can actually make a film in this way that has particles that are running periodically. Here is another example where the investigators are trying to make colored ink. You know, we all know that our Amazon Kindle and so on, you have black and white readers when you read these books. Yeah, they use all electrophoretic motion, and so they're energy efficient, but it's just black and white. What these people found is that if you make a nanoparticles, a couple of nanoparticles, that is, then you can get different colors. You can get bright orange and so on. So you can produce different colors. But one of the main difficulties that happens when you do that is that you tend to make order, and order means like crystalline structure. So if you read it from this side, it will look very different than from this side. And so the crystal structure is not good. So the idea is, how can I make something where I have a short range disorder? Because if I have a crystalline structure, then it would be angle dependent when I read it. And so they are using this idea that there are these parrots in South America. They have feathers that they produce bright colors, like in this case blue. And actually, if you look at those feathers, they consist of nano bubbles that are packed in a random arrangement and so on. So the idea is that you want to nanoscale these things, but have to create an isotropic short-range structure and so on. So that's the goal of this project. Here is another example of particle technology where you can make a nanolayer pores inside catalyst particles, and you can deposit atomic scale or molecular scale that would prevent the sintering and so on. Is an example here of how a ferrofluid might be made cheaper and more stable and less corrosive. So as you know, ferrofluids are used in brakes and clutches and so on. Here is one example of a convertible transport that uses a magnetic selective light control. So it's an MR fluid. So MR fluid means your particles are magnetizable. So when you put an electrical magnetic field, they line up, and when the particles line up, the viscosity becomes very high, several orders of magnitude high, and it's almost like freezing the whole thing. The question is, can you do that with less magnetic particles? And they showed that you can put some non-magnetic particles, which are relatively cheap, and you can still get same kind of rheological behavior. So it is an example of functionalized particles where you can put them in your body and you can plug them wherever you want and would stay there. Say you want to do some surgery or microsurgery, and these are particles that are actually magnetic particles, so you can put something magnetic there. When it comes to the blood and circulates, it stops there. And now, what is the nice thing about it is that you can take it out, and then they will stay there until you want it. And this, you can probably do a microsurgery if you like, or you might use this to now heat them by an alternate magnetic field, whereby you can, if it was, say, if you wanted to put it near a cancer cell, and then you want to, once it is there, fixed, you can then look at it, and then there is a way you can switch back by changing the pH and so on. So these are, you can make the plug when you want and get it out and regular state when you want. So these are some of the examples, and I'm just going to go through some very recent, some of them are already shown in my slides, but just to get an idea what sort of things that they found at the National Science Foundation. So here are some examples of suspensions, a role of interfacial charging and electrostatic image forces in Pickering emulsions. I see a lot of proposals in this area of Pickering emulsions, which is emulsions in which you have tiny particles, so that when you have two different fluids, particles come at the interface between these droplets and they stabilize, and they may replace with surfactants. So there are many desirable properties of these Pickering emulsions, and so some examples of granular particle. One example that's very important is that when you are dealing with powder flow, you tend to develop charges, and sometimes that can lead to disastrous accidents. So, understanding the origin of those charge development and how it goes, and doing a very detailed DFT type calculation, which is at the quantum level, together with experiments and so on, is the goal of that project. Finally, what we are seeing in nano and colloidal lately, a lot of things related to jamming or glass-like behavior. Janus particles. Janus particles are particles, if you like, that are synthesized so that half side of it has a different behavior than the other, and has some interesting properties. They can behave like molecular motors, catalytic particles, and so on. So you can do that for the interesting things. As I said, we do get about 15 to 20% that I would call a particulate system that is of interest in biological systems. So, for example, transport of cells and drug delivery particles. Suppose I put nanoparticles together with my red blood cells and platelets. How do I make sure that what I want, the nano carrier that I'm putting, would go towards the outside or remain inside and so on? And if I understood, and this particular first one has a detailed simulations involving red blood cells and platelets, and putting the nano carriers to see where they end up, how you can modify the structure of nanoparticles so that they will always travel closer to the capillary wall or away from the capillary wall, and so on. They've been able to explain why the platelets tend to travel along the capillary wall and why the red blood cell wall, red blood remain in the middle. And this is in particulate and microfluidics. Okay, so do I have time? Okay. So, of course, what I described is a kind of snapshot of what we are finding. So we have 100 or what, maybe I went over 10 or 15 of them. We get an idea. Each one stands by itself, usually a very well-defined goal, and it tends to be more on a very fundamental side, which is very different, I think, than the kind of problem that we heard today. Right? So in some ways, I think NSF role is somewhat different. To me, I think NSF role is to provide a skilled workforce. I'm imagining that through the program, you are training students to do a very detailed, or to, first of all, to develop first-rate tools, whether it's experimental or theoretical or computational. So that has to be an important thing, right? Then you emphasize novel phenomena in particulate flows. And understanding, getting a good understanding is very hard. Yeah, anybody can model and compute and get this thing, but then getting it right and understanding really what's happening requires that you look at some basic problem, understand it very well. And to me, it's just you're providing that workforce to industry, because then with that understanding, you're supposed to go in industry and solve the real problems. But that understanding is what we're looking at in developing through the program itself. Now, I think the last sentence I want to really emphasize. I think I heard somewhere that less than 5% of the research in this country is supported by industry. And I think it is very, very dangerously unhealthy. We at NSF proudly say that people from all over the world come to understand how we do things. That we are the model system and so on. And that's good. But listening to Professor Joshi, you realize as to how different this model that we have in US, which is, by the way, what a lot of people try to, people support this, versus what it could be. And when industry is putting only 5% and even 95% comes from government support, the university faculty members do things that would be beneficial for their career. And that's why I say it could be dangerously unhealthy, because you really need students to be engaged in things what industry does. And there is a real, when you hear on TV saying that you don't want some bureaucrat inside the beltway dictating, I worry about it. It does happen because we have too much of federal funding and too little of industrial funding. Now this really needs to change, because it's not good for the country. Now, hopefully we can just reduce the federal funding by 50%, then that 5% would almost come up to 10%. That's one way. Maybe that has to happen first, because then everybody in the university will start looking to see how they can be doing things that are really industrial problems, and we will begin to get that 10%, then go to 15%. But I think that the current talk in Washington that you hear all the time, how great the funding is and we should all increase it, I worry about the fact that it does provide less incentive for faculty to work with industry. And I think if we had more things like what Kumar is trying to do here, where you have an effort to have industry universities be good for the students, be good for the industry, good for the academics, and I think it would benefit society much more than what we try to do solely through the federal funding.
Thank you very much, Ashok.